Is Agenda 2030, is it something that's on the books in the U.S.?
I would look at Agenda 2030 as kind of being a template or blueprint. There is no specific law that says this is Agenda 2030, we're going to put it and codify it in law. What they do is they looked at what laws currently exist. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. Let's use these laws and tweak them in order to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
A lot of this came about in the early 70s, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, which were good things, you know, the Endangered Species Act, but it's been abused from what the original intent. Congress did not intend for it to be abused the way it is and manipulated the way it is these days when they wrote those bills. They would have never passed them.
The Endangered Species Act, how that's used to take land. Can you sort of explain that a bit more?
What you'll find with the Endangered Species Act is that in order to protect a species, sometimes you have to protect habitat. That's land. So in many cases, you'll see environmentalists employ the Endangered Species Act to close off development.
Copco and Iron Gate are the only two deep water lakes in the Klamath system. But the environmentalist movement created the crisis for saving the coho salmon, which were never known to be indigenous to the upper region, to force the elimination of the dams or destruction of them.
What you're saying is, in this region, the coho salmon is not really indigenous. Is that the case?
Coho salmon, by Fishing and Game's own definition, is a coastal fish. Its normal habitat extends no farther than 30 miles from the coast.
The Iron Gate Dam is one of 4 dams being removed by the state of California to save the coho salmon. But if what Rex says is true, and the coho never swam here, then why destroy the dams? It's a question that's been irking local farmers and ranchers who depend on these dams for their livelihoods.
Throughout my entire childhood, my parents had several different jobs. Because they didn't inherit this place, they worked hard to have it.
How many years have they owned this plot of land? 40
years. We love this land, but given this global agenda that, you know, feels like it's in our backyard now, I don't know if my sisters and I will be able to inherit this place and pass on and keep what my parents have worked so hard for. If and when those dams are destroyed, it will shut off the water that we have rights to. It's going to totally impact our livelihood. I think it's criminal. What the State Water Resources Board is telling us is that they want to see the coho in this river. But there is no historical evidence of the coho ever being here. They're using a picture of fish that look like salmon. And that's their only best available science that coho existed here.
Todd, could you please introduce yourself and sort of your background as it relates to the waterways and dams specifically?
My name is Todd Myers. I'm the Environmental Director at the Washington Policy Center in Washington State. I have worked on salmon recovery issues for more than a decade and environmental policy for more than 2 decades. I actually personally have voted to fund removal of part of a dam to open salmon habitat. So I've looked at this from all sides of the issue.
The dam removal project that's happening right now on the Klamath would be the world's biggest, right? And it's actually set to start either this year or next year. From your experience in salmon recovery, is there a way to achieve the goal of helping the coho salmon to recover without tearing out those dams?
Yeah, removing dams is not a panacea. There are lots of other things that influence salmon populations. Here in Washington State, a decade ago, we removed 2 dams on the Elwha River, and it was claimed that the populations would recover and that we would be fishing again by now. And in fact, the populations over the last decade have basically been the same as what they were the decade before the dams were removed. That's because there's lots of other factors that play into salmon recovery. And I think too often people become fixated on sort of the romance of destroying dams, and that becomes the overriding interest, where other projects that might do much more for the environment never even get assessed because we become so fixated on one approach.
What lends to that? What lends to people just wanting to tear down dams and not listening to, for instance, your take on it, your opinion that there's so many different options that can be done that wouldn't be so extreme?
I think this is a problem fundamentally when you make environmental policy more about politics than results.
These dams are coming down, and it's about dam time.
The benefits to politicians and to environmental activists are sort of like identity politics. They see themselves as environmentalists, and so they want to express that in very, big ways, essentially virtue signaling, right?
The largest dam removal project in U.S. history.
Tearing down dams is very dramatic. The more dramatic, the better. But if something doesn't work down the road, right, the Elwha, it's been a decade, we're not seeing the salmon recovery that we expected. And so as a result, we probably should have done something different. Well, is anybody held accountable, right? All the people who promised that we would see salmon recovering, that we would see, harvestable levels of salmon. Has anybody been held accountable for screwing up? No.
In addition to dam removals, the state of California has also enacted emergency drought regulations threatening to prohibit ranchers from using their own groundwater.
My husband and I bought a little ranch when we got married 7 years ago, and we run cows on that ranch. We're in a real pinch right now as cattle producers in Scott Valley, where as of last September, the State Water Board has introduced some new emergency drought regulations that are threatening to curtail 100% of our irrigation water that we pump out of the ground. This is all being done in the name of saving the coho salmon.
If this continues down the path it's going, what do you think will happen to your farm?
My property right now doesn't have a lot of value without the water rights that go with it. Water is what makes everything work. In Scott Valley, you can't do anything without water. And so we would have to move, because if we can't ranch in Scott Valley, there's nothing else to do.
It seems like the salmon are not technically endangered anywhere. You can find them in stores, you can eat them, yet they're invoking the Endangered Species Act to essentially take away your water rights. Do you feel like the salmon is the real reason, or is there something going on behind the scenes?
It's definitely not about the salmon. It's about control of water.
It has nothing to do about fish. This is all about rewilding, regardless of the impacts. This is a consortium between Department of Water Resources and California Fish and Game. They are moving to secure all of the control of all the water as we speak in the state of California, now including groundwater.
Water is the thing. Water is the thing that these globalists are going to use to control everything, because we all can't live without water.
Yeah, they have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Water is one of them, but every goal has a bunch of sub-targets, right?
Right.
And in order to achieve them, you do have to essentially micromanage people's lives in order to measure their water usage, et cetera.
Right? It's in the targets that they get more specific. So if you need permission to flush the toilet or brush your teeth or drink a glass of water, you're beholden to their control.
What's a great threat to the United States is a bi-coastal elite that has grown up in 50 years of luxury and affluence, and they're completely unaware of the source of their wealth. They don't know that the consequences of their ideology will make less energy, less food. They feel that they do not want to have oil-based nitrogen fertilizers or pesticides, and they don't need to be intensively farmed for great production. Sri Lanka is doing it now. They're banning chemical or synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. They used to have double the GDP per person per capita income of India. Now they're starving.
Is this really what happens to a country when these policies are enacted? Can implementing Agenda 2030 really lead to the collapse of an entire nation? Sri Lanka is located in South Asia, just off the southern coast of India. The Sri Lankan countryside is made up of collective villages filled with small subsistence farmers with unique challenges. Like, for instance, having to climb up into tree houses to sing the ancient songs of their ancestors to keep elephants from rampaging their crops. But to be honest, in terms of threats, elephants pale in comparison to a government that is pushing forward Agenda 2030 with a strict agricultural mandate, which is now threatening to destroy the lives of the farmers who have been the backbone of the Sri Lankan economy for decades.
Rice is our main staple, and in 1950s, early 1950s, we have been importing 60% of our rice requirement from other countries.
So then moving forward from 1952 all the way up to 2020, a lot has changed, right?
Lots of changes. Our farmers started using synthetic fertilizer in 1952, and that helped us to achieve a very high yield. And starting from 2008, we have been producing more rice than we can consume. In other words, there was a surplus. That was a leap jump forward.
Imagine that. Through sheer ingenuity, hard work, perseverance, and scientific discipline, the Sri Lankan people developed a paddy rice crop that was among the highest yielding in the entire world, allowing them to not only feed their own people, but also to export the crop to surrounding countries, making some much needed money for the national treasury in the process. But this path to prosperity, as well as the food security of the whole country, was inextricably linked to the use of nitrogen-based fertilizer.
More than 90% of the farmers are using synthetic fertilizer. Let me let you know why fertilizer is required. If you want to get 5 metric tons of rice, the paddy plant requires about 105 kilograms of nitrogen. If you don't put those nutrients into the soil becomes infertile. You need the fertilizer to make sure the required amount of nitrogen can be supplied to the plant. If not, you will not get the yield.
Here's a fun fact. This country is actually not called Sri Lanka. This country is officially called the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. And as an openly socialist republic, the government and the president who is in charge of the government can make sweeping changes to the entire country on a whim, which is exactly what happened.
The government of Sri Lanka banned the import of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, and weedicides.
Overnight, the Sri Lankan president, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, banned the use and import of chemical fertilizers. The entire Sri Lankan rice paddy crop had been bred for 6 decades to work symbiotically with chemical fertilizers. And so taking away the fertilizers without any sort of a transition process was like taking out 2 legs from underneath the table. The result was obvious.
Sri Lanka has officially defaulted on its foreign debt.
The country's worst ever economic crisis since independence.
The country today announced that it is defaulting on its debt worth $51 billion.
Protesters holding President Gotabaya Rajapaksa responsible for the nation's economic meltdown.
Motorists, tuk-tuk drivers and taxi drivers queue for fuel in this queue that I hear is stretching 4 to 5 kilometers. This is a scene that is now synonymous with the worst economic crisis in this country in decades.
How did it happen that the president just like this just banned fertilizer?
It's a good question. Some NGOs, some are crazy for the natural environment. They have convinced the president, you can do 100% organic. And apparently he believed it. I realized this is going to be a huge problem with irreversible damage.
We waiting for the queue, very big queue. Sometimes 2 days, 3 days I waiting for the fuel.
You would wait for fuel for 2 days?
Yeah, it's a queue.
You would sleep in your car waiting for fuel?
Yes, a very bad situation. Before 1 liter price is 138 rupees. Now 1 liter 540. Food, agriculture items, chemicals, everything is the price is increased. People are going to extra work.
So you mean like one person would get 2 jobs?
Part jobs. It's a very bad situation in Sri Lanka.
A very bad situation, to say the least. In a couple of short months, Sri Lanka went from a robust agricultural economy with a food surplus to a massive economic crisis that resulted in food and fuel shortages and rising inflation that forced its citizens to work up to 5 different jobs to make ends meet. All because of one new law, unilaterally enacted by its president. And the more we spoke with the people of Sri Lanka, the more dire the situation seemed.
Overnight, they decided to go with a different organic fertilizer. Overnight.
How bad did it get? What kind of shortages did you guys have?
Our crops suffered. A lot of us were struggling without basic things in the supermarkets because the farmers weren't producing anything.
How long have you guys been farming here?
50 years.
50 years right here in this land?
Yes.
What kind of vegetables?
Red radish, cabbage, leeks, carrot.
When the president said no more chemicals, what happened to your farm?
My economy fell down 50%.
Your personal economic situation fell by 50%.
Before we got 10,000 kilos. Now 4,000, 3,000.
Of vegetables. So you went from 10,000 to 4,000.
Normally, we can fill up 5 boxes, around 5,000 kilograms of fresh tea.
So you're saying before, it was not only this, like all this would be full.
All this were full.
That's rough.
Yeah, it's a huge difference.
Do you think the government cares about farmers like you?
No satisfaction.
The difference in vegetable production between synthetic and organic became obvious when we visited one farmer who is still practicing both methods.
This field is 100% organic.
Why only this small plot is organic? Why is not everything organic?
When you compare the other crop and organic one, its yield is little bit poor.
The yield is poor.
Yield is poor. So we can't make a good profit.
So organic is more expensive, it's more labor, and it's less yield. Wow.
Everywhere we went, it was the same story. The farmers themselves know that the only hope they have is to organize and tell their story to the world. So they asked us to sit down with them for a meeting, and what we learned was tragic.
ඒගොල්ලන්ට කිව්වා ඒගොල්ලෝ කිසිම කෙනෙක් ගැහුවේ නැහැ මේ. දැන් අපි කොහාටද යන්නේ? නේද? සම්පූර්ණ ගොවිතැන පිළිගන්න. අද අපි ඉන්නේ ජීවත් වෙන්නේ අපේ දඩපාවල නඩත්තු කරන මට්ටමක නෙවෙයි. තව ඉස්සරහට යන්න මේ තත්ත්වයට ගියොත් එහෙම අපිට වහබොන්න වෙනවා.
Is a lot of that happening? A lot of farmers committing suicide?
හැමෝ සමස්ත ගොවිපදයා මේ ගොවිතැන් කරන මුළු රටම අද ඉවරලා තියෙන ගොවියා විනාශ කරපු නිසා මුළු රටම ඉවරයි.
Suicide. Independent farmers in Sri Lanka are taking their own lives as a direct result of Agenda 2030. And for what? What is so threatening about synthetic fertilizers that's more important than these farmers' livelihoods, and in some cases, their lives?
Climate change is the biggest threat. The biggest threat to any kind of biodiversity, the biggest threat to any kind of nature, of course also the biggest threat for the human beings.
What do we want? Climate justice! What do we want? Now!
At some point down the line, the narrative changed to be around climate. What was the narrative prior to that? What was the justification they were giving in order to push, this kind of more control from the top down?
Yeah, immediately preceding climate and environment, actually the Cold War was the pretext for having this incredibly large, incredibly powerful federal government. In fact, you see a very clear break when the Club of Rome met in 1991 as the Soviet state and the Eastern European communist states were collapsing. The Club of Rome, very, very powerful elitists. Obviously, Mikhail Gorbachev was there. You had many prominent Americans, people like Al Gore. They got together and they came up with this incredible document where they actually said we need a new justification for this all-powerful state. So the new excuse is going to be because the environment is going to be harmed and because climate is going to hurt us.
Wait, what? I could not believe what I just heard. Did world leaders really lay out this globalist plan in plain English in a physical book way back in 1991? I went on Amazon, and there it was. The First Global Revolution, which states, and I quote, "In searching for a common enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. And therefore, the real enemy is humanity itself."
The science is clear. We are getting dangerously close to the point of no return.
The science is very clear. This natural world is severely endangered.
Code Red for Humanity is not a group of political officials, elected officials. These are the scientists.
There is a top-down quality to this policy which is extremely forceful, and the forcefulness comes from scientism, which is the ideology that we understand the world fully because of science. We have to listen to the science so that we have a better future for tomorrow. This is just ideological BS, and it's also quite dangerous. It's a dangerous way of looking at the world because then it means nothing matters apart from science. Culture doesn't matter, history doesn't matter, religion doesn't matter, social interaction doesn't matter, nothing matters but science. You don't need to be a theologian or philosopher to understand that that's complete nonsense, but also dangerous nonsense. If nothing matters than just science, then what kind of a world do we actually live in?
History is truly at a turning point. In times of crisis, the role of governments is more important and more relevant than ever.
The World Economic Forum is actually a critical part of implementing this UN agenda. Some years ago, they became a strategic partner of the UN in the implementation of Agenda 2030. And then you start looking at the connections between the World Economic Forum and China. Klaus Schwab and Xi Jinping, they're like old buddies. They put out press releases about how much they love each other. So you've got the super capitalists represented by the World Economic Forum. And then on the government side, you have communists. Right? After Agenda 2030 was adopted, the Communist Party in China put out through all their propaganda organs, they said, we played a critical role in this Agenda 2030. You had Javier Solana, the head of NATO, saying this was going to be the next great leap forward. Right? The last great leap forward in China killed millions of people. Why would we want another one of those? That's crazy. So you have communists and super capitalists all coming together and working on this one sustainable development agenda. And that should make us all pause and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense on the surface. What's going on here?
China is a powerful example of what can be achieved when national governments make environmental protection a top priority.
The motivations of those who are pushing this agenda, many of them tend to emulate countries like China, which have abysmal environmental records. This is a country that has massive pollution problems. They don't seem to care about rivers and lakes and streams. There's all sorts of toxins pouring into them. In actuality, I would say their envy of China is more to do with their control over their population and control over politics than it has to do with the environment. In looking at this, it looks like the environment's a tool to achieve power more than it is an end goal of itself to actually protect nature.